Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast, where we're helping you lead better every day. And now, here's your host.
Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Day, and we have a great episode for you today. Here in the U.S., it is Military Appreciation Month, and we're celebrating Memorial Day. And today's guest is a man who understands the military. Chad Robichaux is a United States Marine Corps Force Recon veteran whose life was radically transformed by Jesus Christ. He now dedicates his life to serving U.S. military, active duty, and veterans using faith-based combat trauma programs through the ministry he and his wife, Kathy, founded, the Mighty Oaks Foundation. You will hear Chad's amazing story, and Chad also shares some great insights and some great advice about how our churches can best support our military families. I know you're going to appreciate this episode, so I invite you to listen in on my conversation with Chad Robichaux. Chad, I just want to thank you for being with us here on our Church Leaders Podcast. I'm excited to have you share your story with our audience, but I also wanted to say on behalf of our entire team here at Church Leaders, thank you for your service, both as a Special Ops Recon Force Marine and also as a law enforcement officer, where I see that you received the Medal of Valor for bravery beyond the call of duty. So I just want to say thank you, brother.
Thanks so much. It's great to be on and just to really share my story and spend some time with you this morning.
Excellent. Now, you've seen a lot in your life, Chad. You've been engaged in and you've been a witness to a lot of violence over the years in different ways. As a Special Ops Marine deployed to Afghanistan 8 times, as a law enforcement officer, and then you're also you're a mixed martial arts world champion. But now you are a board-certified pastoral counselor, you're a best-selling author, and along with your wife, Kathy, you founded the Mighty Oaks Foundation, which is an organization, a nonprofit that serves our U.S. military, both active duty and veterans. And in that ministry, you guys kind of walk people through discipleship programs that seek to bring healing and wholeness to the brokenness that they experience in their lives. Now, when we look at your life, those two worlds, for many people, right, they might seem really far apart. Can you share with us a bit of your story and how this all came to be?
Yeah, when you hear it spoken out, it really sounds like 180 degrees and two opposite ends of the spectrum. But in reality, to me, it's all the same. I'm a fighter. I've always been a fighter. Everything I've done in my life, and to this very day in ministry, I feel like I'm in my biggest fight. And that's what we really do at our ministry is that we teach people how to fight to be the men and women that God created them to be, how to be the leaders that we're all called to be, and how to do the work that God, challenges us each day we wake up to do. To do those things, to be who God created us to be, requires a fight because everything in the world is going to pull us away from that. And so I think a lot of my past, as a reconnaissance Marine, as a professional fighter, as a police officer, the different things I've experienced have really just equipped and prepared me to take up that mantle and continue in the fight for the work that we do at Mighty Oaks, but also to pass those lessons on to others.
That's awesome. Now, can you talk to me a little bit about your experience? Like, how did you come to Christ, and how did Christ begin to take these experiences of your past and transform them in a way that would ultimately bring glory to God?
Yeah, well, I grew up from a father who's a Marine as well. He's a Vietnam veteran. So I grew up in a really rough childhood. My father was extremely physically abusive. He probably suffered with PTSD, although I don't think he was ever diagnosed with it, but he definitely was very angry, very discontent man. And growing up in a household with a lot of physical abuse, the siblings get really close. So my brother and I he was a year older than me. We were really close. We used to talk about joining the military together to really escape the lifestyle we were in and maybe get a fresh start at life. And when I was 14 and he was 15, he was shot and killed. And to me, that was like, even though I grew up a rough childhood, that was just a really devastating time in my life. The little family I had kind of disintegrated. And by the time I was 17, I pretty much had isolated myself and fulfilled that quest of wanting to join the military. And when I was 17, I got a chance to get that fresh start and join the United States Marine Corps. I didn't even have a high school diploma at that time. And the Marine Corps gracefully took me in and gave me that second chance at life. That was 1993. So obviously a long time would happen before I'd actually step into a real combat zone. But I did my first year become a recon Marine and started that quest to do this job that I wanted to do. And I did 4 years of active duty and then switched to the reserves for 4 years. And while I was in the reserves was when I was a police officer. And also at the end of that 4 years when 9/11 happened, it set me back on my quest to go back in the military full time, eventually go to Afghanistan 8 times as part of a JSOC task force, a Joint Special Operations Command Task Force. And if I would have looked back at my life and asked if I was a Christian when I went to Afghanistan, I would have said yes. Maybe because it was stamped on my dog tags or because I claimed to be a Christian. Maybe I identified with that. I even took my family to church, but the truth was that I probably took my family to church more to be in control, like to manipulate my family, to drag my wife there to be a good, godly, virtuous woman and be my kids to go to Sunday school. But like for me, I was definitely doing church at a distance. I wasn't truly having a relationship with God. In fact, my view of Christian men was Christian men were weak. That's how I viewed it. And in part, there's probably some truth to that. But so I go to Afghanistan and have to make this choice of how to do my job as a warrior in this evil place and do this very difficult job. And I made a decision. I thought, can I do this job as a warrior and being this Christian or being this man of morality, a man of God? And I thought, by not understanding who Christian men were, I thought I couldn't do it. So I feel like I deliberately made a choice. Like I could do that later on in my life, but right now I have to be this warrior, and that can't include this man of morality, this man of faith. And I believe that's a lie that many men believe today, not just in combat, but just in life, that somehow Christian men are weak or you have to trade your masculinity for Christianity. And thankfully, not today, I know the truth that there's nothing more strong and more courageous than a man of God who stands up for the things of this world that need to be stood up to. But without understanding that at that time in my life, I believe I left a hole in my heart that was filled with just hate, rage, and bitterness, and eventually the other things that would start to erode me, which was the anxiety and the separation that I chose to be from a relationship with God, and it almost cost me everything. I started my job at being very, very intense because I lived with the local nationals. I didn't live on a base, so I learned what the Taliban had done to these women and children. And politics aside, if we believed we would belong in Afghanistan or not, the truth was like learning what had happened to these people. My heart went from wanting to retaliate for 9/11 to really wanting to make what had happened to these people right. And so being around these, playing soccer with the kids and having dinner with the families, like understanding what had happened to them, I really had a heart for the Afghan people and a hatred towards the Taliban. And so that intensity, which I share with everybody who worked with, ended up turning into something that I couldn't turn on and off when I come home. So I'd come home from being in Afghanistan, 24 hours later, I'm home with my wife, and immediately feel out of place. I want to be back in Afghanistan. I want to do this job. I feel like the guy replacing me can't do my job as good as me because I'm so arrogant about my work. And honestly, I felt very out of place at home. And that intensity crept its way in my home life, and my household became not a very happy place for me to come home to. My children were scared of me. My wife was scared of me. I was like a time bomb that would snap off in fits of anger. I always tell the story, share a story of my daughter. The reason I probably do is because I'm so shameful of this moment in my life, but it's just an example of how it was every day. My daughter was having a birthday party and wanted me to make it home from Afghanistan, and I did, and she was so excited, and she had her cake, and she's very opinionated. And as a matter of fact, she's home right now from Bible college. She's just a really strong personality, so she didn't like the icing on her cake. And I grabbed my little girl's birthday cake in front of everyone and just grabbed it and threw it against the wall and destroyed her birthday. And that behavior was the norm. I'd throw these fits of uncontrolled rage, and it worked really well in Afghanistan, but it didn't work in my home. And the further I went down this road, the more I realized it, and the more I felt I needed to separate myself from my family. that anger started turning to anxiety, and I started having these physiological symptoms come over me. Like my arms would go numb, my face would go numb. I felt like my throat was swelling shut, and my heart was like maybe have a heart attack. And I didn't want to tell the people I worked with in this little special operations community, because I felt like if I said something, not like felt like it was actually the reality. If I would have said something, I would have been ostracized. I would have been viewed as weak and pulled from my job. So I chose to not say anything, kind of push it down and keep going forward and doing my job. And that lasted for a little while. It got more and more difficult to do that. But eventually these symptoms progressed, and I started having what I know to be now panic attacks. And I started losing gaps of time. So I started forgetting things. In fact, my last period of time overseas, I lost about 2 weeks that I couldn't even remember. It was very foggy.
Wow.
And I felt like at that time I had to say something, because not only was I putting myself in a situation where I was unsafe, but the people I worked with.
Right.
And so when I did say something, I was brought home, and that was the first time that I sat across from my psychologist and was told I had PTSD. And just like I had suspected, I was immediately removed from my job, and I was very ashamed. I was very scared. I felt like I failed. I felt like not only did I fail, but I felt like I was going to die at any moment, because the physiological symptoms are so overwhelming. And I didn't know what else to do. My wife and I worked this with its counselor. They put me on medications, but the medications really had made me feel like a zombie. And the doctor's like, you need to do something physical. You need to get active. And so I went to what I had always done. I've been a martial artist since I was 5 years old, wrestled into jiu-jitsu. And I'd already been a professional MMA fighter. I was doing it on the side, and I was undefeated, so I was pretty successful at it. And so I got on those wrestling mats and tried it. And the first time I got on those mats, I literally felt like I found a cure, because you can't, wrestle and do jiu-jitsu and think about Afghanistan. Your buddy's going to choke you. It's like one of those things you have to pay attention. So for me, I felt like, wow, this is it. This is the answer. This is my the solution to all these problems. And the truth is, jiu-jitsu is good for me, and I still do it to this day. The pastors listening will probably agree that ministry is pretty stressful when you have bad days in ministry, and so I have bad days now. And when I do, I just go over to the gym and find some 19-year-old stud, and I choke him out. It makes me feel good. But the truth is, though, you can have something that's really good for you, and you can abuse it. And that's what I did. I took this hobby that's good for me, and I used it as a Band-Aid, as a crutch to get by. I never really got better. I just would have anxiety. Instead of going to a bottle of alcohol, I'd go on those wrestling mats and spend 10, 12 hours a day on those mats training, doing fights, and spending that much time into it. It gave me this level of success that was really accoladed. I became a top-ranked fighter. I won a world championship. I eventually was 18-2 as a professional. And so I had 1,000 students in my school, and to start surrounding myself with all these people that were really telling me everything I wanted to hear, but no one telling me what I needed to hear. I didn't have any accountability, and it was really just a recipe for disaster. And this fake facade of success kept building up and building up and building up, and eventually, it all came crashing down. My marriage was still dead. I was still having panic attacks. Me and my wife would sleep in separate bedrooms, and I started becoming very, very depressed. And I ended up stepping out of our marriage into an affair. I didn't care at that time if my wife even knew. I wasn't trying to really even hide it. And so we ended up selling our home. We rented 2 separate apartments, 12-month leases. And so we were pretty committed. We started all the divorce paperwork. And my wife and I had 2 different reactions. My wife, she went into a church, and she just started praying for me. She said she didn't know how to pray for me, but she would spend every day in this church. And she said she was so angry that she picked up the book Power of Praying Wife to help her through it. And she would pray, God, let me see Chad the way you see Chad. Let me love him the way you love him. And let me forgive him the way that you forgave him. And
wow.
So she would pray for me. And, I feel like I'm a living testimony of the answered prayers of a Power of Praying Wife. And meanwhile, I was in that apartment, and for the first time, I think I had time to think about what had happened. I started to realize that while I had blamed everyone else, everyone's an idiot, that this situation's everyone else's fault. I realized that, although my dad did what he did, although, I had things to complain about the military about, and really I blamed my wife for not understanding what I was going through, and all these people I blamed. I realized that I was the common denominator. Like, it was me. And when I came to that conclusion, there's really two ways I could have looked at it. I could have changed, or I could have let it take me even deeper. And I let it take me deeper because I had realized I was a problem. And I said, well, this is a hopeless situation. I'm only going to hurt them worse. And so maybe they would be sad without me, but they'd be better off. And so I made the same decision that 20 plus of my veterans make every day, that I was going to take my life. Mm. And as a police officer, I had seen suicide scenes before. So I knew that my kids would probably be the one that would find me. So I thought I could make it look like an accident. And I had heard a statistic that 1 in 3 children from a parent that commits suicide would do it as well. And so I thought I didn't want to leave that legacy for my kids. So I was trying to contemplate how to make it look like an accident. I remember there were times I would just sit in my closet with my pistol for like hours, trying to build up the courage or trying to think through it. And during that time, my wife had came to my apartment, and she had the divorce papers with her, and she was coming to get me to sign them. And I was being really difficult because obviously I wanted to sign them, but I also was being a jerk. And so she asked me how I could do all the things that I did in my life, like the military, becoming a reconnaissance Marine. She was there. We met when she was 17 and I was 18 years old. So she saw me go through that training. Saw me go through all these schools. She saw me do these deployment workups, the training, and she knew what we were doing on deployments, how crazy some of our deployments were to Afghanistan. And then she saw me get ready for these MMA fights, like cutting 35 pounds of weight and training like when you're tired and just having the discipline to do it anyway. And so she's like, how could you do all of that, and when it comes to our family, you'll quit?
Wow.
And that question, it like radically impacted me because, as probably to me, there's no more soul cutting word than to be called a quitter. And she was absolutely right. While I had been successful at professional things, when it came to the most important things in my life, being a husband, being a father, being that 17-year-old kid that had a brand new chance at life and wanted to do something important with it. And the reality was I had quit. I had quit on all those things, including my own health. And I made a decision right there that I was gonna turn it around, and I was gonna take the same work ethic, character, discipline, everything that had made me successful professionally, and I was gonna fix this situation. It wasn't a faith-based decision at the time.
Okay.
It had nothing to do with God. What I did realize, and I think God gave me the insight of this, is that I couldn't do it alone, and I couldn't do it with the people that I had surrounded myself with. Because remember, I had people that were just telling me what I wanted to hear, not what I needed to hear. I didn't have any accountability. And so I went to my wife and I said, hey, this church you're going to, do you think there's a man in there that could help me stick to this decision I just made? And she called the church, and I met with a man named Steve Toth at Starbucks. And Steve never served in the military. In fact, his intentions were to introduce me to a retired Navy SEAL who was a pastor. But I think God uniquely qualified Steve with some gifts to help me. I think his greatest gift was ADD, because he didn't have the patience to deal with my manipulative personality. He's a real impatient guy. As a matter of fact, like if you go to a restaurant with him, he literally will run across the parking lot to his car because that wastes his time walking.
Oh, wow.
So he's just got that personality. And anyways, we were sitting down at Starbucks, and I had written a plan out of how I was going to fix my life. For the military guys listening, I wrote like a 5-paragraph operational order of how I was going to fix my life. And I slid it over to him, and it was very detailed. And he didn't even read it. He just slid it back to me, and he said, you're going to fail. You're going to end up right back on your face, falling on your face. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, you don't even know me. Like, I wrote this amazing plan. You didn't even read it. And, like, I felt kind of disrespected, And he's like, it doesn't have anything to do with your relationship with God. And if it doesn't start there, you end up right back where you are. And I'm not going to waste your time, and you're not going to waste mine. And what I didn't know was that the last guy Steve had tried to mentor before me had taken his life just a few months prior. And he regretfully wasn't bold and firm with that guy.
Wow.
So he was with me. And we have a saying at our, the foundation at Mighty Oaks Warrior Programs that if what you're doing isn't working, then why not try something different? And the truth was I had tried everything. I tried the pills, I tried the counseling, I tried jiu-jitsu and MMA, but none of those things had worked. So it was really time to try something different. And so I just trusted him, and I ended up surrendering my life to Christ in a very authentic, like, hey, I want to give this a truly 100% commit my life and surrender my life to God and see what's going to happen. And I did that. But beyond that decision, Steve mentored me for a whole year in biblical manhood. And through that journey, what I discovered was that what had happened to me didn't really put me in the situation I was in, right? My childhood, Afghanistan, losing friends, doing things that I did, being part of things, the anxiety, the things that triggered my anxiety, all those things didn't put me in the situation I was in. What had put me in the situation I was in was the choices I had made. And I never lost control of that. And when as simple as it may seem, when I realized that I had control again, and that the events of my past didn't control my future. And now I'm getting mentored in biblical manhood. And so now that I know I have the ability to choose, I have a set of principles to choose from. In fact, the very principles we're designed to choose from. And that was the biblical blueprint of life, of manhood for me. And I started doing that. I started recalibrating my life and making choices according to that. And some days I succeeded and some days I failed, but I kept being intentional about it. And I tell you, like, it didn't mean the anger didn't go away. It meant when I got angry, I responded differently. It didn't mean the anxiety went away at the beginning, but I responded differently. And so because of that, my relationship started to find restoration, and I started feeling like I was in control again, and my life started to change. And really the anxiety that would lead me to the point of having these panic attacks started going away, and I was able to get off the medications even. And what I felt like I discovered at the end of that was the very purpose that I was created, because I felt like when I was going through this, I was the only one. I felt like no one possibly could be suffering the way I am, and no one could possibly be experiencing the hopelessness, the despair in their marriage. There's no way possible anybody could be experiencing this. That's how I felt. And I think a lot of people feel that way when they're going through that.
Right.
But the truth was, and we see it statistically, I mean, I'm right here next to Camp Pendleton. There's an 85% divorce rate in military veterans. There's 20 plus suicides a day. Like, I wasn't even close to the only one. And, but now I felt like I had the solution. And the only way I could really explain it is like the passion I felt was like if I had terminal cancer and was dying and somebody gave me the cure, like I didn't feel like I wanted to pass it on. Like I felt obligated to pass it on to others. And so when my wife and I decided to pay that forward, it was still pretty new for us, but we just felt compelled. We felt like God called us to pass this on. And so we walked away from everything to start Mighty Oaks, not because we wanted to start a big, national nonprofit like it is today. We just wanted to pay forward what was done for us. The challenge my wife gave me, the second chance that God gave me, and the mentorship that Steve gave me, we just wanted to pay that forward. And it's been such a blessing to do that and pay those that experience and the lessons of succeeding, but also failing, and finding restoration and finding hope, and ultimately finding purpose, the very purposes that God created us to live.
Chad, as you were sharing that, what really stuck out to me was just the boldness and the obedience to God that your wife, Kathy, and also your mentor, Steve, really demonstrated. How has that boldness and that obedience really played out in your life as you are reaching out to minister to active military and to veterans through your foundation?
Those two things you mentioned are the DNA of what we do now. I mean, one, Kathy was, if you look back at Kathy's story of forgiveness for me, it was completely selfless, because she was convinced when she gave me that challenge that our marriage was over. So she wasn't saying these things to manipulate my heart and try to get me to come back. She was convinced like our marriage was over. She, as rotten as I was to her and the damage I caused to her, she could have hated me, but she chose to love me even if it didn't have anything to do with our marriage.
Wow.
She felt she was being obedient to God to do that.
Right.
And for me, she was worried about me. She wasn't worried about marriage. She was worried about me, and she felt she was needing to be obedient to God to do that. And Steve came in, and he didn't think he was coming in to restore marriage. He also thought it was gone. And so both of them acted out of obedience. Now, when I say it's in the DNA of what we do, we're probably one of the few veteran organizations that do what Kathy did to me, is confront them, challenge them. Kathy confronted me, and she hit that pride button. If the first moment that we get with the veterans, we challenge them the same way she did, and that's part of, written into our methodology, because most people that deal with veterans, particularly combat veterans, they're esteemed because we're thankful for their service, and I am thankful for all of our warrior service, and so you get hung up on honoring them, and that attempt to honor them sometimes can be enabling and block us from actually being able to give them the help they need. And so we tell them how much we love them, how thankful we are, and we almost give them a pass on some of the behaviors. Where in our program, we're peer-to-peer, so we are them, and we're able to tell them the hard things that their spouses sometimes can't tell them, that their counselors can't tell them. We're able to tell them, hey, it's time to get up off the ground because you're better than this, and you could do something important again, and this isn't who God created you to be some kind of victim of the circumstance of your past. So we're able to tell them those hard things and challenge them like Kathy gave me that challenge. And then we're also able to do for them what Steve did for me, and that's to equip them to pay it forward to the next guy, which is discipleship. Steve didn't just try to make me better. He tried to prepare me to pass that on to the next guy. And so when we get our guys, the first thing we do with them is we challenge them and to get back in the fight, and to get back up off the ground and be a warrior and be a leader again. And then we also tell them, you're not here just to get well, but you're here to be in a position to help the next guy, because you are a leader. You're created to be a leader, and getting well just isn't good enough. That's for you, but you're created. It's bigger than you. It's not about you. Life isn't about us individually. It's about Him and serving Him. And we can't serve Him, and we can't be who He called us to be while we're sitting down on our butts and knocked down and mad at the past. And so the very things that Steve and Kathy did for me, we're able to pass forward through this program and the methodology we use to help other warriors. And I believe that's why it's grown the way it has. That's why we've had the success we've had. We've had in our core legacy program, which is a 6-day replication of what Steve did for me in a year. We've had 1,362 graduates, many who were really struggling with suicide and divorce when they came. We've had 0 suicides.
Wow.
And all of our staff now, all of our leaders and all of our adjunct staff and team leaders, they're all alumni out of that program. So we've taken warriors who had fallen on their face and hit a point of ultimate hopelessness and despair, and we've risen them back up to be those leaders again, and ultimately they're serving the kingdom and winning souls for Christ and turning other warriors around to do the very same thing.
How cool is it that Kathy and Steve's model of obedience has really become the foundation of your entire organization? I love that. Now, as we're thinking about the church leaders in our audience, how do you feel the church can be most effective in coming around military families and helping support them? What have you seen that is most effective?
I think, and there's a lot of churches that have military small groups. It's a tough demographic for a lot of churches, and I mean, being here in Southern California, obviously, if a church has a military small group, it's going to be packed. If you're in, Bales of Hay, Iowa, right here, you probably don't have as many. But even if it's a small group, to get them started. But when you do these groups, I think it's very important that they become a pit stop and not a destination. Those warriors should have a transition from being in a military group that they feel comfortable in to growing out of the group into the body of the church and the body of Christ, and to be able to use those skills outside of that. This is a big problem with a lot of veterans groups. They end up staying in this kind of watering hole. A lot of them, a lot of times in bars, and it's been it's 40, 50 years there in the same spot. They never go beyond groups. And so, I really encourage pastors who actually start these military groups to do them in a way and organize them in a way that they're not meant to be a permanent destination, but just really a pit stop for these warriors that they're helping.
That's good. That's great advice. What about the military families themselves? Are there some cool things you've seen churches doing that have supported military families?
Yeah, I mean, we have. So in addition to our legacy program, we do resiliency conferences. So I go speak a lot at the resiliency conferences for all the different branches, and I speak to not only the warriors but the spouses, and then we have an outpost. We also partner with the organization called Reboot, who does outposts, which means they're planted in a church. They do weekly meetings around the country, and some of those groups do couples together. And I think it's very important because what we found early on when we started doing our program at Mighty Oaks is we were only serving male combat veterans. And so these guys would come to the program, they make a radical decision to turn their life around. They go home and they'd implement this, and they'd almost leave the spouse behind, the same spouse that was praying for them in the first place. And much was the case with me and Kathy. And we had to find a balance in that for Kathy and I. And so we've actually started a spouses program, and we run out of about 30 programs we ran last year. We ran 3 spouses programs, so it's not as many, but we see the importance of it. And they're bringing bringing them in a holistic path together that we're able to do it in unison and be on their own independent journeys, but also their journey together.
Very cool, very cool. Now, you mentioned domestic abuse, divorce, suicide, that those rates are really high among our active duty military, among our veterans. I know your program kind of speaks into that specifically, but are there other things specifically when it comes to these 3 big areas that you would, provide some guidance maybe for pastors or churches to kind of help in these areas?
I think if to reach veterans who are not going to come in the churches, and this is the same for any area the church wants to impact the people outside of the walls of the church. You got to be reaching out and doing outreach to reach these guys, particularly that are struggling. A lot of times when we see these military guys at a point of hopelessness and despair to where they will go through a divorce or even worse, take their life. If you really look backwards from the incident of suicide, you see a pattern of really, really deliberate isolation. No one saw it while it was happening, but it did happen. And then I compare that to the people that we've seen rescued through Mighty Oaks. And it was always because someone reached out to get them there. In the worst cases, someone reached out to get them there. And many a times, I'm really proud to say that it was someone from a local church that had heard about our ministry and knew that it was a free resource to the church. And they went to them and they said, "Hey, I know you're struggling, and I know you're hurting, and maybe I don't have all the answers, but here's a group of guys who are just like you, who have maybe been through some of the same things, and they found the solution." And the guy might turn them off. He might not seem interested, but they leave a flyer with him, maybe one of the books that we've written. And in that moment of hopelessness, they have something to turn to, and a place to go to when they need help. We had one of our veterans who came through a program, Mike Pretty. He came up with this crazy idea that he was going to ride his bike across country to raise to raise awareness for Mighty Oaks and what we're doing.
Wow.
And I'm like I'm very cynical towards raising awareness for any problem, because something like veteran suicide, everyone talks about a problem, and the truth is everyone knows it's a problem. I prefer raising awareness about a solution, right?
Right.
A solution, right? And it seems like people get excited about talking about problems, and oftentimes are quiet about solutions. And but Mike was going to ride his bike across country to talk about the solution. And he rode all the way across the country, and he was going to raise, he had this big lofty goal. He was going to raise all this money for us. And I think he went in the red, negative pretty bad to do it. And in addition, he lost a lot of weight, and his legs were pretty sore. And so he was really down. But along the way, he stopped at churches and he handed out flyers and these little DVDs that promoted what we did, and showed some of the testimonies at the ranch. And he was pretty down about it. And I was like really encouraging him, "Hey, God's going to show you fruit through this. So sometimes you may not even see it." And he just so happened to be at Sky Rose Ranch in California. One of our partners, Serving California, provides this amazing 22,000 acre ranch for us. And we're going through the program, Mike's team leading, and this former Marine stands up. He had to get burned. His face was really burned. And he said, I had reached a point of complete hopelessness. I decided that was it. I couldn't go any further. And he sat in his recliner with a shotgun next to him and enough liquor to numb himself to actually do it. And as he's drinking and building up the numbness to actually pull the trigger, he looks on top of his television, and there was a DVD. A pastor of a church had given his dad to give him, and he had never looked at it. He was just cynical, didn't want to see it. But he put in that DVD, and when he started playing, he saw the other veterans that are program, and he started crying. And that night, he called his dad and said, "Hey, I need you to come. I don't trust myself alone, and I need you to get me this program." Mike was there and heard him tell this testimony. Mike had drove that bike across and handed that DVD to the pastor.
Wow.
Who gave it to the dad, who gave it to the son. In an ultimate moment of ultimate hopelessness, he saw it, and God used it as a tool to save this man's life. And, so the faithfulness of doing the littlest of things to reach out and be intentional about reaching out, it's just like any other ministry.
Right.
Saves lives, restores families, changes legacies, and ultimately it'll change the world and the kingdom of heaven. And it's through those deliberate actions.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So that whole bike trip across the country, he got to see that it was worth it, even when he thought it wasn't. He got to see the real fruit of that. That's awesome, and that's an encouragement, I think, to pastors, because pastors, ministry leaders, we're lots of times we're doing our thing and we're being faithful, we're being obedient, and like you said, many times we don't always see that fruit, and sometimes we can get down and discouraged and feel like, man, I'm trying so hard to honor God, and that's just a word of encouragement that we never know the impact that what we're doing is ultimately going to have on the kingdom. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and Mike said, man, if I'd have knew that, I'd ride my bike backwards across the country. And I think, and we say this in our leadership training, because we have a very deliberate leadership training process. We get really selfish and self-ambitious about ministry, and we feel like we have to be the one, right? We have to be the one that sees the results. But the truth is, like, if you really look at the process of ministering to someone broken, to see them come into full restoration, you have a process of someone that plants a seed, someone that waters a seed, and someone that harvests a seed. You rarely get to be all three.
Right.
And so it's really trusting God's process of doing that. If you're all three every time, you may start feeling like God. But if you maybe have one of those three roles, maybe you're the guy who plants the seed. You never see it water, you never see it harvest, but God does. Or maybe someone else planted the seed and you get to just water into it, and someone else actually works on the harvest later on. Or maybe you're the actual one that gets blessed to see someone come to Christ. But I believe as God orchestrates his plan, there's these three phases that happen through different people a lot of times, and you don't always get to see all three of those things, and you have to be okay with that and trust God that you just get to be part of the process. And it's one of the things that I think has taken a lot of pressure off of us as we train our ministry leaders to be team leaders at Mighty Oaks, is that don't try to do it all, because that's not your job. It's God's job to do it all. Someone else, we may get someone that comes to this program that someone's already planted, someone's already watered, and they come, they're just ready.
Right.
We may get a guy that our only job at Mighty Oaks is to plant that seed. And then we need to point him to a church where he goes to church and they can water it, and someone else God has in store to reap that harvest. And it's just something I think we have to accept in ministry and just trust God with that process.
I love that, Chad. That's a good word. That's a great word of encouragement, and I'm sure that there are many pastors, ministry leaders listening even now that's resonating with their heart in a great word of encouragement. I love that. I love it. Listen, Chad, I know that there are different ways that people can connect with you and your ministry. I know if they go to outreach.com/speakers, they can connect with you and book you to come and speak at their church or maybe at a community event. You've written several books, and you have a new one coming out here in July, right? And what was the title of that new one?
That's right. It's An Unfair Advantage, a Victory in the Midst of Battle. And really blessed. We have Lieutenant General Boykin, who wrote the foreword. If you guys don't know who he is, he was our Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. He was one of the founders of Delta Force. This amazing guy, 36 years in special operations, and endorsed by David Barton, Alan West, Sergeant Major Kent, who's a 16th Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps. And what I share in An Unfair Advantage is a bunch of stories, kind of fun war stories from Afghanistan and from MMA, but each chapter goes into a parallel story of biblical time warriors, and we kind of unwrap an unfair advantage found through a life of faith and a pursuit to be the people that God called us to be. And it's really was an exciting project for me to do and share some of these stories. So I'm pretty excited about it. We'll release it July 4th.
That's awesome. We'll have links to how they can connect with you as a speaker, and then also links to your books on our show notes for this episode. But also, how can they connect with you through your ministry. So if they have people in their churches that they think Mighty Oaks would be a great opportunity for them, what's the best way for ministry leaders to go about connecting?
Well, they go to our website, which is mightyoaksprograms.org. And you should know that all our programs for both veterans, active duty, which we get a lot of active duty, and veterans who are out already, as well as spouses, all our programs are free. If they can't get to our programs, we do have a scholarship fund for travel.
Wow.
And we'll make it happen. So definitely the church is listening. Utilize us as a resource, no strings attached. We have 4 locations nationwide that we bring our veterans to, and we run 30 of these programs per year. And if the church needs help to outreach to veterans, we definitely can come and be part of that too through our speakers team.
That's awesome. That's awesome, brother. So again, our listeners can find links to all these, as well as some other helpful resources from today's podcast by visiting ChurchLeaders.com/podcast. And you can click on Chad's podcast episode and links to all of this, including the Mighty Oaks Foundation, his ministry that he and Kathy founded, will all be there and available to you. So, Chad, I just want to say thank you, brother, for sharing your story with us. And I want to thank you for, I love what you said in the very beginning, that you've always been a fighter and you're continuing to fight. You're a warrior for the kingdom, and you're fighting on behalf of brothers and sisters who have served the military and are going through difficult circumstances. And your heart, Kathy's heart, and your entire team there at Mighty Oaks is seeking to help them find some restoration and some healing. That's an awesome mission, and we'll be praying for you as you continue to fight and be a warrior for God. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Jason.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us on today's episode. We certainly hope you enjoyed the podcast. And if you are indeed finding value from the Church Leaders podcast, we'd appreciate you taking just a few moments to jump over onto iTunes and to leave us a review. Your positive reviews and ratings help other church leaders find our podcast so they can benefit as well. We thank you so much in advance. And until next time, this is Jason Day, encouraging you to love well and lead well.
You've been listening to the Church Leaders Podcast. For articles, videos, and free resources that will help you lead better every day, visit our website, ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.